Today, I'm delighted to introduce a man who needs no introduction, Bob Frenz, the author of Historic County Schools of McHenry County, Illinois. Bob is the go-to guy for historic schools information, including what happened here in Union District 113. Please welcome my friend and yours, Bob Frenz.
I think I can take this off now. 6 feet away. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Paul. I think a couple of years ago, it occurred to me that this would be the 150th anniversary of our Union School. And I mentioned that at a board meeting, and well, you see what happens. You get to give a talk. So anyway, I'm pleased to, proud to be able to tell you a little bit that I know about the Union School. First of all, I welcome everybody to and tell the people that are really dedicated to history, seeing that baseball is back now and the Cubs and the Sox are both playing tonight. Plus we're here in the middle of a pandemic, so you folks are really dedicated. Louder? Okay. Get my teaching voice back.
You want the microphone?
Yes, you need your microphone.
Okay. All right, is that better?
No.
That should work.
All right, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, Kurt was giving a little bit of an introduction about what was going on when this building was built. And it occurred to me today that Ulysses S. Grant was in his first term as president. The Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed the year prior. Civil War had only been over for 5 years, and our Union School was built. So, that puts it in pretty good company. By the way, before I get into Union School itself, I was also thinking that there's only this is a town school, really, what we would call a village or a town school for the town of Union. And there's only 2 that are still standing here in McHenry County that are older. With one in Greenwood, which is built about 1858, 59. And there's also one in Ringwood, which is built in 1862. That was also a 2-room school. There's a number that are kind of near or kind of as old, but they are not as old. McHenry, the landmark school in McHenry, I think is around 1890, 95 maybe. Harvard, excuse me?
1894.
94, thank you, Henry. The Central School in Harvard, which you see right there on 14, was built about 1888. So this is quite a bit older than those even. So, and we are fortunate to have it as our headquarters. So, with that in mind, I want to read a quote here. This is from the July 1870 edition of the Woodstock Sentinel. And it states, "There is being built a very good school in Union. It is of stone, 2 stories, 32 feet by 64 feet, and will contain 4 rooms. 2 large ones, 28 by 29 for general school purposes, and 2 smaller rooms for recitation." Now, how many know what recitation was? No. Well, the teacher in these early schools, and in fact well into the 1900s, would have the students come up like 1 or 2 at a time and recite their lessons orally for the teacher. It might be math, it might be spelling, reading. And so recitation was a very important part of the school day. So that's, and I'll have another reference later to recitation. The entire cost will be $8,000. Think, to build the building, $8,000. We talk about that now for, some roof repairs or things like that Kurt is well aware of, right? Old buildings have a way of costing, in addition to their charm, they can also be costly.
The article went on to state, the project is not being pushed forward too fast, but when completed, it will be an ornament to the town. At that time, Union was only 19 years old, established 1851. So just think, in 19 years, they put up a very large, very nice school. Nancy, I found a comment by Nancy Fike, who was our former administrator, and I thought it was really an important comment. She said, just imagine to the community and people living in this vicinity to see this huge, for that time, really huge building going up here in Union. The biggest thing I'm sure they saw at that time was a barn, or I'm not sure the silo was even invented in 1870. I forget when Hatches first put that one up, but it must have certainly made an impression on people at that time to see this very large building going up. Now, who built it? Well, there's one story that a Mr. Henry Bright was driving by one day, and he saw some students or some youngsters carving their initials or doing some mischief in the mortar. And so he stopped and admonished them to stop doing that. He says, I built that. Now, we don't know if he was talking about the mortar or the building itself, because we have another story that an Earl Crandall, who was born, raised, and attended school here in Union, stated that the school was built by his grandfather, Henry Crandall, in 1870. So, two different versions. I'm kind of thinking maybe the latter one, and in the first case, he was maybe just talking about he was the one that did the mortar and the bricks, Mr. Bright. But anyway, we're quite certain that the limestone, which you, of course, noticed when you walked up, this building is built of limestone, we believe was quarried near Garden Prairie. And there were several limestone buildings here in town at one time. And then it was probably transported here by horse or oxen and wagon. And just imagine, how difficult that must have been to haul that amount of limestone to construct this building by wagon. There was a railroad. I'm tending to think, though, that it was probably done by horse or oxen and wagon. Now, you've noticed additions. The first addition was to the north, and that was put on about 1928. And it was a classroom originally. It's our research library today. So we think that was the first addition put on. About 1938, the second floor of the 1870s structure, that is the original building, was converted to a gym. And here the kids played in bad weather. The community held meetings, suppers, etc. And the first floor then contained a library. And the students going to school here, of course, could check out books there. And also, interestingly, the rural teachers, of whom there were several, brought their students here to check out books as well. Probably, one day a week or maybe once a month, they could come and check out books as well. And I should mention that in addition to this town school, there were also several rural or one-room schools right in this area. Only a couple miles from here. There was one just the other side of where the Railroad Museum is, and there was another one out on Hemmingson Road to the east of here. So, and when I get to some of these pictures here, you'll see how large some of the classes were. And it's interesting to think that in those days, Union had so many people and families that they, were able to have large classes and had to put additions on the building even. About 1948, the new gym, which is where we are today, was added on the east side of the building. So we are pretty certain about 1948 that this was added. Now, as you can see, it's a meeting and an exhibit space. Now, let me just say a word about the instruction here. Generally, there were 3 levels of instruction. Primary, what was called primary, which meant the younger grades. There was no kindergarten in those days. You would have started with 1st grade, probably through 3rd or 4th would have been your primary. And then you had an intermediate, which would have been either 4th, 5th, 6th, and then, or maybe 8th, and then in upper grades, which would have been what we would refer to as high school. Now, the thing is that high school back then did not mean the same thing as high school today. 2-year high schools were very common. I'm thinking that maybe for a while this had contained a 2-year high school and not a 4-year high school. You were not required to go to school. There were no compulsory education laws in Illinois, in fact, until the 1920s. So a lot of kids either just went hit and miss to school, maybe some didn't go to school at all. Now, of course, you're supposed to be in school when you're 16, but that was not the case back then. But we're pretty sure they at least had freshmen and what we would call freshman and sophomore here. Now, and I'll be showing you this later, the first graduating class was in the early 1890s. We think about 1893. The law changed about 1918 or 1919. The law in Illinois was changed, and it said that all students had to be part of a 4-year high school district. Didn't mean they had to go, but they had to be in a district so they could go if they wanted to go. And at that point, Union, I'm not going to use the term consolidated, but they then sent their high school age students to Marengo. Consolidation with Marengo, the actual consolidation with Marengo didn't happen until much later, but for the high school, they, after 1918 or 1919, then would go to Marengo. And by the way, that high school is still standing. It's now the middle school in Marengo. So these buildings then continued to educate grade school students until the late 1960s. About 1968 or 69, this ceased being a we'll and it actually sat vacant for a couple of years. In 1971, we're coming up to a 50th anniversary. I sense maybe another party anniversary coming up here. 1971, the McHenry County Historical Society purchased this building and has owned it ever since and made many changes to it. So there's been all sorts of changes here in the original building. Now, I want to quote from another old newspaper article. Glenn Noble, who graduated from 8th grade in 1934, and I should also mention a lot of kids at that time, especially in the 20s, probably didn't get beyond 8th grade. It was still kind of rare for high school education, but Glenn Noble graduated from 8th grade in 1934, and he remembered just 2 classrooms in the old building. No lockers, no showers. He said there was steam heat and indoor plumbing, but the outhouses were still out back. One of the pictures I'm going to put up here in a minute, and by the way, Kira's made copies of it up here on this front display cabinet of them, if you want to look at later too, of the outhouses. By the way, the state law changed on that too about 1915, 1916. Most all schools had outhouses, and then the state came and said, you know, that's really not real sanitary. We talk about sanitation today, and kids in 1915 and 16 were still going to outhouses. But the state said, yeah, come on, this is the 20th century, let's get with it. But he remembered that one of his teachers used a big ruler. He said, you know, it was one of those like about a half-inch thick. And the teacher would rap you across the knuckles with that if you didn't behave yourself. So there was a lesson that stuck in Glenn's mind. The 1895-1896 record book still exists. And at that time, there were 3 teachers for 85 students. Just think, 85. And the school day was from 9 o'clock to 12:30. So you only had a 3.5-hour day. That was not uncommon. In the 1890s, pretty much every district was on their own as to how long they wanted to have it, or how they didn't have a 9-month school year. If they wanted to go 7 months, that was fine. Each district made its own decisions. And then again, the state stepped in and said, you know, that's really not right. We should have something uniform. In 1909, 1910, the intermediate teacher, Otto Seidenstrang, wrote the following. And this is something that I, as a former teacher, and I know a number of teachers are here, could probably agree with. He said, "We did not have hardly any singing or opening exercises until near the last of the year, on account of having crowded recitations." There is that word again, recitations. Try to make, and he's talking probably to the next teacher that's going to come along, try to make work interesting, and it will be easier to cover required work. And then this last, if lessons are too hard, they stay out for a day or so. Of course, no student would do that today, you know. He says then his advice is, make them make it up. Now, the teachers in these record books would also put their comments on what they thought of the school. So it's very interesting. They always rated the school rooms, and again, we're talking about the 1870s structure, as excellent. But the outhouses were always only poor or fair. Imagine that. They also wrote down how many books were in the library. This is how I got a lot of information from my book on that Kurt mentioned about the country schools. Because the teachers at the end of the year would have to write down, here's what we have in our library. They would even write down how many trees are on the property. So a lot of useful information there. And by the way, that's another thing I forgot to mention. I did find that in 1932, the students planted an elm tree out here to commemorate George Washington's 200th birthday. Why it wasn't a cherry tree, I'm not sure, but they planted an elm tree, which most of you, I think, are aware of what's happened to all the elm trees in McHenry County and elsewhere, so I don't think it exists anymore. But anyway, now, teacher salaries in the 19-teens and 1920s range from $45 to $105. Now, you're probably thinking, was that, what, a day, a week? No, that was a month. That was their monthly salary. There's also a notation in these record books that in January 1918, there was a vacation on account of a coal shortage. And you know why there would have been a coal shortage in 1918? World War I, absolutely. And of course, the military use of coal was, in the estimation, more important than school for a week. In October 1918, 5 weeks of enforced vacation on account of Spanish influenza. 5 weeks. And then I have to end with this, again, as a former teacher, and I know a number of you were, kind of a cryptic note that a teacher, I don't know what year it was, but a teacher left in the record book, and this was from a parent. And the parent writes to the teacher, "Please leave," and I'll just give the first initial as I, might have been Irene. "Please leave I leave the room at will today, as I gave her a laxative. So that's the kind of advice that the teachers got. So anyway, I thought we'd take a look at a few of the slides of the building. Pretend that that little rectangle up there isn't there. It's not supposed to be there. I'm not sure why it is. That's the Union School as it looks. In fact, let's see. You can see 1870 right up there. It says that. Now, this is the first graduating class that we have a photograph of, and is there one? I think there's one boy and like 5 or 6 girls in the class, right? And the teacher, right? Mr. Sullivan was the teacher. Okay. So that's the first graduating class that we have a picture of or a photograph of. And here then is a graduation or commencement invitation, which we're all familiar with. But this one says, I think that's the 5th graduating class, right? So, and this was 97. So I'm thinking the first one must have been around 1892 or 1893. Again, with the caveat that I'm not sure what the ages were, or if they're talking about like what we would consider to be senior graduation. Some of them in that first picture looked a little young to be, like, I didn't think they were really 18 maybe, but I don't know. Now here is one of the earliest photographs that we have of the building with some of the students outside. And it appears, I don't think this one was dated, but it appears that it was probably taken around 1900 from the clothes that they're wearing. The teacher is in the picture. If we look closely, maybe on the left there, that might be the teacher. But again, the students in this case were unidentified, and I don't think the teacher was identified either. So, but that's a very early view of what the building looked like when it was fairly new yet, maybe only 30 years old. Oh yeah, this is the one of the 4th grade classroom, which they said was upstairs. And I think it said in the southeast corner, yeah, the southeast classroom upstairs. And I want you to notice, if this in fact was just the 4th grade, how many kids are in that picture? And think, you know, how small Union is today and how few people live here. But, you know, the thing, of course, back then is the farms were much smaller. And, you know, it took more people to work the farm, and some of them moved into town, lived in town. So maybe it's not so surprising that Union was able to, and this was kind of a rail center too, you know, the train stopped here. I think now in 19, what year was that? 1912. Boy. Test my memory on this, whether the interurban was running yet and stopping here in 1912. We need Craig Foncook here to tell us the answer. What?
I was going to say, where's Craig?
Yeah, Craig needs to be here to tell us, but I'm not sure if it was built yet or not. But of course, there was a stop on the interurban. The railroad stopped here, so. I thought that was an interesting picture anyway, showing you don't get that many that are inside the classroom and the teacher, so I kind of like that one. Now, yeah, this is the one shows the outhouses. Long device. Out in back here, of course, the school's over here, and apparently a band, they had like a band stand or out in, probably, I'm thinking, if my corrections are right, it'd be about out where our school or the capital is today. Band shell, like, and then you can see the outhouses back here behind the school. This is 1919. Shortly after the law was changed and said, hey, you gotta have indoor plumbing, but as the one student said, those outhouses were still there even in the 30s. And the other thing to notice, of course, and Kurt is, I'm sure, he's a water expert, by the way, a hydrologist, I think they call him. And you
Whether
can
I
see,
want to be or not.
note the flooding that's taking place there. So, things haven't changed much in 100 years. I put that one in there for Kurt's benefit. Okay, and now here, think of this. This is 1950. It says that right on the ball. Girls basketball team, 1915 here in Union. Talk about progressive. This is 60 years before Title IX came about. That was in 1975. Talked about having equal sports activities for girls, and here they are. I think there's 6. Is there 6 or 7? I forget.
7.
Yeah, 7 of them. So a full 5 and a couple of substitutes there in 1915. So I love that picture too. Their uniforms and of course that's long before this, which became a gymnasium, was built, and so it would have been in the original 1870 structure that they would have played. Nice. Okay, this is another class photo. This was labeled the upper grades, and what's the year?
1900.
Yeah, we think about 1900. I'm not positive. I don't think this one was dated either. But again, looking at their clothes, this thing was probably around 1900. And that's the intermediate grades. Excuse me, upper grades. So here it would have been your what we call 8th grade, 9th grade, probably 10th. They kind of look to be about that age, would you think? Seemed like when I was looking at it, so I think that's probably right. Sometimes looking at these old photographs, it can't be, it's like looking at anyone, that people write on it. We find a lot of mistakes here. Take my word for it. We've had people come in here and say, well, we look at old photographs like of Union, and we had this group come in last year and say, oh no, that's all wrong. That's not so-and-so, that's this person. And no, that's not that year, so we have to be very careful. And Kira, being our collections expert, knows that for sure. Okay, so that's probably around 1900. Now, this one, again, this is the intermediate grades here. And I don't think that was dated either, but from their clothes, it looks like around 1920 to me. From the dresses and the hairstyle, it looks like some of the girls, in fact, and you can correct me on this, are wearing what they call the flour sack dresses. Don't they look like that? And the hairstyle, I know my mother had one of the girls in the back had the hair kind of down like this, and that's the way they were wearing in the 20s. So I'm thinking this is in the 20s this was taken. And again, another view of our school and the brick and the mortar, which has some issues also today. But anyway, that's the way it looked about when it was 50 years old, around 1920, and the students. And this one of the band out in front, and they've got their band instruments and their band uniforms. And I think this was taken in 1930, right around 1930. So that's the way it looked then, and the students. Okay, if you have any questions about this or want to say anything about it, just, yeah.
Bob, I was just curious as to why the first graduating class wasn't until 1890. You figure if the school opened in 1870, figure 71 at 12, you would have expected a graduating class around 1983, 84.
It just was not a common thing. I don't have the figures with me, but when I did my book, you would be amazed at how few kids went to high school. Nationwide, it was just a few thousand in the entire country that had a high school diploma. So it's not at all unusual or unexpected. They probably just, you know, there were private schools. I suppose they could have gone, or maybe they could have paid tuition to go to. I think Marengo started having high school graduating classes in the 1870s, certainly by the 1880s, so maybe they could have done that. But for most students, their education was over by 8th grade. So I don't think it's a good question, but I certainly don't see anything unusual about it, that they wouldn't have had a high school here.
And nobody did 8th grade graduations, did they? I had people tell me that that was not considered a big deal at that time.
I've not seen a photograph of an 8th grade way back then. Certainly probably by the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s, they were doing it, having a graduation ceremony. But certainly not way back. So anyway, that's anybody else? But that's the band. Now, this one shows a class in the 1928 edition, which is today our research library. Notice it looks markedly different at that time. It was a classroom where we have file cabinets along that wall today. They had windows looking out on the street. And one of the things I noticed, looks like about a 1940s automobile. But I'm thinking from the way the kids are dressed, it's maybe more like the 1950s or early 1950s that this was taken. Notice the radiators along the wall, and also it looks like there was 2 doors. We just have one. I think the other one was probably closed off. And by the way, again, notice the number of kids. It's probably not just one grade, but it's maybe 2 or 3 separate grades. But you know, I think I counted 33 kids in this classroom. So just think about that. The little union. Okay? I just thought it was a very interesting picture. Now, as I said, after 1969, it stopped being a school, and a gentleman came along, I think from Marengo, and took a couple pictures of it in 1972. This is about the time the Historical Society purchased the building and started converting it to other purposes, which still includes education. And that's the way the building looked about 50 years ago, when it was no longer, and you can see the windows were all boarded up by that point. And I think just one more view of it there. With, again, our very signature cupola up there on the roof, which really stands out. And you can see that from a long ways away. And we just had that all redone, repaired a number of years ago, but I think they did a fantastic job on that. So, and repairs are just ongoing up there, aren't they, Kurt? And I think that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Henry?
I think a lot of them graduated. I have my dad's original certificate from William Clay Grade School, and before 1897, he graduated in 1912. It's been going about 15. He had a list of everything he had done. He had a regular certificate, and it's like a county school superintendent. And so I think they did go, they went for 2 years, they considered it like a high school.
Yep, right. Not at all unusual. In fact, the other thing that's interesting is that teachers in those early days, a teacher that taught in what we call grade school today only needed to have a high school education. That 2 years would have sufficed it. But then they said, well, you know, it's not really enough. You should have a 4-year high school education before you become a teacher. So then it became 4 years, then of course, today you have to have a college degree. Marlene?
I noticed that the last Heritage Fair, I think, or in the autumn, there was the display on the sidewalk, and a lot of area residents were looking at the pictures. They had been former students. Are the
Yes.
former students going to have any kind of gathering to mark the anniversary?
I've not heard of any. I was hoping that some of them would have been here tonight. We certainly would like to have had reminiscence from them if they had, but I don't think anybody here went to school in Union, did they? No. I have not heard of any. Last year, it was last year, wasn't it, Kira? That I think in the summer we did it, and there was a lot of them that came in, and this is when we found out, oh, that's wrong. You know, what we have been saying for years, that's, you know, was taken this date, and these are, you know, that's so-and-so, no. So we actually had them sit down and say, no, you identify these people, and I think we got a lot of it straightened out that way. Yeah.
I think state-supported kindergarten came in about 1953, right? State-supported kindergarten. And I wondered if that was the case, where they lumped in with the elementary kids.
Oh, I'm sure they would, sure, yeah. I don't want to date myself and say when I was in kindergarten, but I know by the time I was, yeah, which was before that. In Chicago we had kindergarten. Yeah. You didn't have kindergarten? Out here? Where? No. Where?
Chicago. Well, we were in private schools. We were in Catholic schools.
Oh, I was in a public school.
Kindergarten.
No kindergarten. Now, you know, way up into the 1950s, I think that a lot of the rural schools didn't have kindergarten well into the 50s. And by that time, most of them had consolidated. Consolidation took place 47, 48, 49, so.
Well, I grew up in Downers Grove, and I know that people said that state-supported kindergarten came in. My sister was in the first class, and it was 1952-53.
Okay.
I was in 47.
And where was this?
1947. This was in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin.
In Wauwatosa? And they had it?
Fisher School, there's Highway 100 and where
Okay.
the northwest one.
And that was a public school? Was that a one-room school?
No,
Okay.
4 rooms.
How many?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
But there it was multiple.
Oh,
Pretty good sized school, and that lasted for a while, and then they rebuilt it a little bit farther west. But yeah, 47.
I think that kindergarten actually originated in Wisconsin, if I remember correctly. But is that right, Henry? That it, yeah, I think it started. It was a German.
Somewhere up in that area. Ripon, Wisconsin.
Ripon, yeah. Well, that's the Republican Party that was started there too.
That general area.
The kindergarten, yeah, it was brought over from Germany. The Germans, so many Germans living there. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you, and really good. I think we have cupcakes to celebrate the 150th. So,
Yeah.
all right.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, as you leave out there, there's cupcakes. So we couldn't have a birthday cake because of COVID, right? So we got your own individual birthday cakes. and then some lemonade. So thanks again for coming, and have a good